Boston, 1852. A man vanishes. Not just any man. He is the son of a preacher, last seen walking to the fog-thick streets of Beacon Hill. His coat was found draped over the iron fence of Mount Auburn Cemetery, though his body was never recovered. Rumors whispered that he had gone willingly into a grand townhouse, lured by the promise of wealth, or something darker. This is where our story begins. Not with a man's disappearance, but with the woman who awaited him behind the gilded doors of that house. A widow of unfathomable wealth, her fortune drawn from shipping lines and sugar, but her hunger directed towards something stranger, her daughters. Young women raised in seclusion, never seen in society's ballrooms, never allowed to speak to suitors. The widow wanted heirs, not husbands. She paid young men to visit, to leave behind their seed, and then vanish. But the story doesn't end there, because something in that house, something beneath its walls and within its bloodline, began to corrode the city itself. This is a story of inheritance, of a family stitched together with secrets no one was meant to remember. And it begins with a silence that has lasted over a century. On Beacon Street, among the row of stately brownstones, there stood a house that seemed too ornate for its age. Heavy curtains cloaked its windows, shutting out the street's curious eyes. Neighbors spoke of late-night sounds, cries muffled by wind, the dragging of furniture, or the low chant of voices in unison. The widow herself was rarely seen in daylight. When she did appear, she was draped in veils of black crepe, her gloved hands pale as bone. Some said she had once been beautiful, the kind of beauty that Boston society prized, angular, porcelain, untouchable. But by 1852, grief and obsession had sharpened her face into something severe, almost skeletal. Her daughters were hidden. Tutors came and went, but the girls never played in the garden or joined the church gatherings. It was whispered that they were too delicate, too strange, too watched. And yet, men did come to house. Young men, mostly from working families, dock workers, and errand boys promised wages beyond their dreams. They would vanish inside the widow's halls for nights at a time, emerging pale, dazed, and silent. Some were never seen again. The newspapers did not report this. Boston, a city of sermons and institutions, kept its sins neatly folded beneath the hymnals. But diaries, police reports, and a single surviving confession tell us that the widow's obsession was not merely to fill her house with grandchildren. It was to preserve something older, something bound in the marrow of her bloodline. There were 3 daughters, known only by first names and surviving records: Eliza, Margaret, and Clara. They lived like shadows in their own home, rarely glimpsed except through second-hand accounts. A laundress recalled seeing them one morning. Pale figure standing barefoot at an upstairs window, hair uncombed, eyes fixed on the street with intensity that unsettled her. The widow guarded them fiercely. Priests were called to bless the house twice a year, yet no suitor was ever allowed to court them. Instead, the men who came at night were led upstairs, past a stairwell where portraits of the family's ancestors stared from the walls. The daughters, it was said, were instructed to receive these visitors in silence. No words, no bonds, only ritual. Children were born but rarely survived. Birth records vanish. Parish logs are incomplete. A midwife claimed to have delivered 3 infants within that house in one winter, none of whom lived to see spring. Their graves were never found. Yet the daughters grew older, carrying the burden of their mother's fixation. Their bodies became vessels of a strange, private inheritance, one that was never meant to touch the daylight of Boston society. And when the daughters began to speak of what they saw at night, shapes at the foot of their beds, voices whispering their names, the widow silenced them with laudanum. The house was not simply one of wealth. It was one of containment. By 1852, Boston streets were swelling with immigrants, Irish laborers, free black families, desperate men seeking work. The widow's offers reached them in whispers: one night service, a month's wages. Many accepted, but what they found inside that house was not the transaction they had imagined. Men spoke, before they vanished, of rituals that felt older than marriage, older than Scripture. They described being watched as they lay beside the daughters, the widow herself standing in the shadows of the room, her veil pulled low. They said the air smelled of iron and candle smoke, that the windows were nailed shut, that the daughters' eyes rolled back as though they were elsewhere. And always, before they left, the men were asked to sign a paper, a contract. None remembered its words. Those who did not return were often written off as drunks or runaways. A city built on Calvinist respectability had no room to examine what its wealthy women did behind closed doors. But the truth festered. A silence became a sickness. Boston's docks whispered of curses. Churches held prayers without naming the sin. And the widow's house grew fuller, not with children, but with secrets. Thomas Hale was the son of a Unitarian minister. Educated, well-mannered, respected. His disappearance was the first that Boston's upper circles could not ignore. On a fog-heavy night in November 1852, Thomas was last seen near Beacon Hill, carrying a leather-bound journal. The next morning, his coat was found near the cemetery fence, his journal missing. His body was never recovered. Witnesses swore they saw him enter the widow's home that night. None saw him leave. The minister demanded answers. The police made inquiries, but the widow's well spoke louder than their questions. The case was quietly dropped. Yet fragments of Thomas's writing survive in archived letters. In his final weeks, he wrote of dreams. Corridors too narrow to walk through, a child crying the walls, a woman's voice repeating his name in the dark. He described the widow as a keeper of something not meant for God's light. Thomas Hale vanished, but his words did not. And in those words lies the beginning of what Boston forgot to remember. When city surveyors filed property records for Beacon Street in 1852, they noted an oddity. The widow's townhouse was recorded as having subterranean extensions, rooms beneath the foundation, marked only as storage. These tunnels connected to older brickwork, remnants of pre-revolutionary Boston. The widow never mentioned them, but deliveries arrived at odd hours. Crates marked with salt, iron filings, and medical supplies. Neighbors noticed wagons at midnight, unloading materials that vanished into the basement door. Later testimonies from a housemaid, one who fled and lived long enough to speak, revealed that the basement was no storage. It was a ritual chamber, its stone walls inscribed with patterns the maid did not recognize. She described candle holders set into alcoves, a great table bolted to the ground, and stains upon the floor that resisted scrubbing. She said she once saw the daughters led down there by their mother, barefoot, their nightgowns dragging. She heard a humming that was not singing, but something like the drone of bees. And she swore that the air in those rooms was not the same air as above. It was colder, damper, full of a weight that pressed on her lungs. The house above was silence. The house below was hunger. Boston in the 1850s was a city that prided itself on order. Churches, seminaries, orphanages, schools for the poor. But order thrives on denial. The widow's activities were never printed in the Boston Daily Advertiser. No minister condemned her by name. Even the Hale family, whose son had vanished, was urged to keep their grief private. To accuse a woman of means, one whose donations gilded the church pulpit and clothed orphans, was unthinkable. Yet whispers persisted. Dock workers muttered of young men paid to enter her service. Midwives spoke of infants buried in secret. A doctor at Massachusetts General, unnamed in records, described being called to treat one of the daughters, her womb torn, her pulse faint, the widow watching in silence as if her child's life mattered less than what might be lost with it. The city knew, but the city chose silence. Silence preserves reputations. Silence preserves power. and silence lets rock grow unseen. It is here that the story deepens. Not just a family's corruption, but an entire city's complicity. Boston did not bury its ghosts. It bricked them into cellars and let them whisper through the walls. Among the artifacts tied to this history, only one piece survived intact: the diary of Clara, the youngest daughter. Its pages, brittle and water-stained, were found in a trunk unearthed during renovations of the Beacon Street house decades later. Clara's handwriting shifts between clarity and chaos, as if written during moments of lucidity and fever. She writes of her mother's commands, the men who entered her room, and the punishments for refusing silence. One passage describes a night when the widow pressed Clara's hand to a candle flame and whispered, "Pain will bind you to the bloodline. Pain will keep the child." Clara also records her dreams: a man knocking at her window, faceless and tall, a cradle that rocked without touch, voices echoing through the pipes, calling her by names she did not recognize. But the most haunting entry is dated weeks before her death at 17. She says the children are not ours. They are theirs. We are only doors. The diary was hidden beneath a loose floorboard, wrapped in cloth. Why it survived when so much evidence was destroyed is unknown. Perhaps Clara wanted someone, anyone, to finally hear her. There was one man who tried to stop it: Father James O'Malley of the North End Parish. An Irish Catholic priest, often scorned by Boston's Protestant elite, O'Malley ministered to laborers, dockhands, and immigrants, the very men who disappeared. In confession, he heard their fears. Men spoke of being summoned to the widow's house, of being bound by contracts, of leaving with money but without memory. He began to suspect the widow's rituals were not just personal perversions, but something older, something that echoed Catholic whispers of heresy, of blood cults that predated New England's Puritan foundations. O'Malley confronted her. He wrote in his parish notes that the widow laughed when he threatened excommunication. She reminded him that Catholicism held little sway in Boston's elite Protestant circles. And she told him plainly, "You mistake me for a sinner. I am a custodian." Weeks later, O'Malley vanished. His shoes were found on the Charles River's bank. His parishioners buried an empty coffin. The widow attended the funeral, dressed in immaculate black. By 1854, one daughter, Eliza, had given birth to a child that lived, a boy. His birth was not recorded in any church, though his existence flickers in census margins and whispered recollections. This child was kept from the public eye, raised within the townhouse walls. Neighbors claimed they saw him only at night, pale as chalk, walking hand in hand with the widow in the garden long after midnight. The boy was said to speak in strange cadences, repeating prayers in Latin he should not have known, humming hymns older than the city itself. Some swore he had no shadow when he passed beneath the gas lamps. Boston never acknowledged him. But decades later, when genealogists trace certain families of unusual prominence, families who seemed to rise without reason, they found the boy's blood threaded through their veins. The widow had not sought husbands for her daughters. She had sought continuity. And the boy was the heir not only to her wealth, but to her silence. When the townhouse was finally sold in the 1870s, contractors made a discovery that never reached the public press. Behind plaster walls were narrow chambers, just wide enough for a cot or a chair, airless and sealed. Inside were rusted chains affixed to the floor, scraps of cloth that looked like children's garments, and carved symbols burned into the wood. One chamber contained a mirror. Its surface was cracked, but etched along its frame was a repeating pattern of circles intersected by crosses, symbols no priest recognized. Workers swore the glass did not reflect their faces properly, only blurred shapes. The records of these findings were purchased quietly by a private collector who later donated them to Harvard's Peabody Museum. But the items themselves, chains, garments, and the mirror, disappeared. Whispers suggest they were destroyed to prevent scandal. But others say they were taken, kept safe, studied, as though part of something larger. The house was renovated, repainted, resold, and Boston, a city in love with its progress, continued forward as if its foundations were not worm-eaten with secrets. But those who labored in that house told stories until they died. Stories of a place where walls listened, where rooms were not rooms but cages, where silence itself had weight. By the late 1850s, Boston's orphanages were overflowing with children left destitute by famine and poverty. Yet records show that every few months, the widow's carriage arrived at one particular institution, the Ursuline Asylum for Girls. Witnesses said she donated generously, always under the guise of Christian charity. But behind closed doors, she was allowed to interview certain girls. Young, impressionable, often fragile. Several vanished into her household as servants, never to return. The link between her daughters and the orphanage deepens a horror. Children without parents, absorbed into a family that devoured its own. One nun, Sister Agnes, wrote in a private letter, "She seeks not to help these girls, but to bind them. Her questions are not of God, but of blood. She asks after their lineage, their mothers, their grandmothers, as if searching for something carried in the veins." The church dismissed Sister Agnes as hysterical. She was reassigned, her letters buried in parish archives. But the orphanage records show gaps, names struck from ledgers, adoption papers without signatures, and in the margins, faint notes in another hand. Taken to Beacon, Boston is a city built upon buried layers. Puritan meeting houses, Revolutionary passages, drainage tunnels. Beneath the widow's townhouse, excavations in 1883 revealed a tunnel that did not align with any city plan. It extended toward the river, brick-lined and low-ceilinged. In its walls were niches filled with melted wax and bones too small to belong to adults. The tunnel was sealed by order of the city council. Officially, it was dismissed as a smuggler's passage from colonial days. But one inspector, a man named Frederick Lang, wrote in his journal that the walls were covered in marks of unholy geometry, and that the bones bore not the marks of decay, but of ritual cutting. Lang's journal survives in fragments, but his death was abrupt, a fall from scaffolding 2 weeks after sealing the passage. His colleagues burned his notes, though his wife preserved the pages he hid in his coat. The city buried the tunnel, but the ground still remembers. Some modern surveyors claim their instruments misfired near that block of Beacon Street. Compasses spinning, levels refusing to settle, as though the earth itself rejects what it once held. Eliza, Margaret, and Clara did not live long lives. By 1860, all three were dead. Consumption, according to official records. But consumption leaves its victims hollowed slowly, coughing into rags. Their ends were swifter, more violent. A physician who treated Margaret swore she spoke in tongues hours before her death, her voice alternating between whispers and shrieks, sometimes echoing as though 2 voices came from her throat. Clara's diary ended abruptly the night she was found convulsing on her bed, her fingernails torn from clawing at the mattress. Eliza, the mother of the surviving heir, died in childbirth, but the midwife claimed her body was not as it should have been. Bones too soft, veins blackened as though poisoned from within. The widow held funerals, brief and cold, with no open caskets. She paid for marble headstones at Mount Auburn, each bearing only first names. But the daughters' deaths did not end the story. They were a sacrifice, intentional or not, to something their mother served. The boy lived, and the bloodline did not end. The boy, unnamed in most records, grew under his grandmother's watch. He was tutored privately, forbidden from mixing with Boston's elite children. By adolescence, he spoke 4 languages and read texts his teachers claimed no child should know. He never attended church, yet quoted scripture with unsettling precision. He corrected priests on passages in Latin, citing versions predating the King James Bible. Neighbors recalled seeing him in the garden, staring at the ground for hours, as though listening to something beneath the soil. One recalled him whispering into the earth, "They are not gone. They are waiting." When the widow finally died in 1868, the boy inherited everything. He did not squander it. Instead, he funded schools, seminaries, and hospitals, institutions that gave him access to the vulnerable. And though he never married, children bearing his features began appearing in Boston's orphanages, their mothers unnamed. The silence passed from widow to heir, and Boston's blood was marked. The funeral of 1868 should have been a spectacle. A woman of wealth and prominence, a benefactress to churches and charities. And yet, the ceremony was sparsely attended, guarded by silence. The minister spoke briefly, never naming her deeds, only calling her a pillar of providence. The coffin was sealed tightly, though whispers said it was not her body inside. Some claimed the widow left instructions that her remains not be viewed, not touched. The undertaker allegedly handled an empty casket weighted with stone. Afterward, her townhouse curtains were drawn for months. The heir emerged pale and expressionless, and the house became his alone. But the strangest detail lies in Mount Auburn Cemetery. The widow's grave bears no date of birth, only the inscription. She kept the line. The words stand to this day, eroded by rain, but visible enough for those who seek them. In 1872, a Harvard divinity student named Edward Finch claimed to have discovered documents connecting the widow's family to forbidden texts in the university's library. Finch wrote of an old ledger, marked in Latin, detailing the family's ritual practices. He described diagrams resembling the tunnel symbols, alongside notes suggesting the widow's ancestors had practiced rites in England before settling in Boston. Finch presented his findings to a professor, who dismissed him. Weeks later, Finch disappeared. His belongings were removed from his dormitory, his name struck from class rolls. The ledger he described has never been recovered. But Harvard's archives contain gaps from that period, boxes of missing correspondence, misfiled manuscripts. It is as though knowledge itself was sealed away, much like the widow's cellar. By the 1880s, whispers grew around Boston orphanages once more. Children began appearing, pale, withdrawn, prone to speaking in riddles. Teachers said they drew symbols in chalk that no one had taught them. Some of these children bore uncanny resemblance to the heir, his sharp features, his unsettling gaze. Their origins were never listed. Adoption records are blank or signed by benefactors whose names link back to the heir's foundations. One schoolmaster wrote, "They do not play. They sit in corners listening. And sometimes they whisper in unison words I do not understand." Several children vanished from records by adolescence. Some reappeared years later, rising quickly in Boston's civic ranks. Doctors, lawyers, politicians, men and women whose power seemed unearned, yet whose silence was absolute. It was no longer a family secret. It had become a city's inheritance. In 1891, a small circle of reformers attempted to expose the truth. Journalists, clergymen, and doctors banded together, gathering testimony from laborers who had once entered the townhouse, and from nuns who had seen the orphanage transactions. They compiled a dossier nearly 200 pages long, which they planned to publish in the Atlantic Monthly. The night before the printing, the offices of the magazine caught fire. The building was gutted, the reformers scattered. 2 vanished entirely. The dossier was never recovered. The official report called the fire an accident, faulty wiring. Yet the survivors whispered that men in black coats had visited the office hours before the flames. And one journalist wrote in a final letter to his wife, "We have touched something the city itself feeds upon. If we speak, Boston burns." By the turn of the century, Boston seminaries, Schools meant to train priests and ministers showed signs of quiet corruption. Certain students received anonymous funding, their tuition covered, their careers smoothed. These men often spoke little of their benefactors, but their names surfaced later in hospital boards, church councils, and even politics. A rumor spread that the heir visited these seminaries in secret, selecting young men as his grandmother had once done, binding them with money, silence, and contracts no one else ever saw. One seminarian confessed to a roommate that he was asked to father a child for a family that carries a charge too heavy to die out. He left the seminary the next week. Months later, he was found hanging from a beam in his father's barn. The seminary records do not mention him. His existence is preserved only in fragments of correspondence. By then, the silence was no longer confined to one house. It stretched across pulpits, across hospital wards, across the very language of the city. Boston had swallowed its horror and called it tradition. By 1905, the heir was funding hospitals across Boston. At first glance, his donations seemed philanthropic: new wards, medical schools, equipment. But the patient records from these hospitals reveal anomalies. Mothers admitted for childbirth who never left. Infants registered without surnames. Unmarked graves in hospital yards. One nurse, in a letter smuggled to her sister, described being ordered to carry a newborn from a delivery ward to a locked room in the basement. The child did not cry. She claimed it smiled. She wrote, "They tell us it is adoption, but no mother returns for these children. And when I pass the locked room, I hear them singing, though I know they cannot yet speak." The letter ended abruptly. The nurse was never heard from again. Today, when researchers examine hospital archives, certain years are inexplicably missing. Files burned, indexes destroyed, wards renamed, as though someone knew where to cut the record, severing the thread. And yet, whispers remained among staff, of infants who grew too quickly, of children who seemed older than their years, of a lineage that fed itself through the city's veins. Boston's private schools began to notice a strange pattern. Certain children, often orphans, often unnamed beneficiaries of scholarships, excelled unnaturally. They quoted ancient texts. They drew maps of places they could not have seen. They spoke of tunnels beneath the city. One headmaster, shaken by an incident in 1912, wrote in his diary, "A boy of 7 recited to me a prayer in a tongue I do not know. When I asked who taught him, he said, 'The grandmother speaks to me at night. His grandmother has been dead for 44 years. The headmaster resigned. His diary was found decades later, hidden in the false back of a desk drawer. Even today, certain schools retain scholarships funded by untraceable estates tied to 19th century bequests. When asked, administrators shrug. Money endures. Memory does not. But the children, those children endure. In 1921, the heir himself vanished. He was last seen walking into the old townhouse on Beacon Street, now decayed, curtains drawn. Servants reported hearing voices at night, multiple voices, though only one man had entered. By morning, the house was empty. No body, no air, only the smell of iron in the halls and the sound of dripping water in the cellar. Neighbors swore the windows glowed faintly for nights after, as though lit from within by fire. Then darkness returned. The estate transferred quietly to distant relatives. The house was sold, gutted, turned into offices. But construction workers found the tunnels again, sealed them again, and spoke of shapes moving in the corners of their vision. The heir's disappearance was never reported in the newspapers. Boston preferred its silence intact. But the bloodline did not end with him. Genealogists who trace Boston's prominent families often stumble upon gaps. Children unacknowledged, mothers unnamed, lines that begin without origin. And yet, certain features recur. A pallid complexion, black hair that turns gray too early, eyes described as watching even when they are closed. Some of these descendants sit on hospital boards. Some teach in seminaries. Some fund orphanages that no longer call themselves by that name. The widow's shadow remains in Boston, not in a single house, but in the city's very architecture of charity, education, and faith. Institutions born of silence carry silence forward. The children may not know their inheritance. Or perhaps they do. Perhaps they are waiting, just as their ancestor once promised, waiting for a time when the silence no longer needs to hide. And perhaps Boston itself, in its churches and schools and graveyards, is the ritual, the vessel the widow built. What began in 1852 as the obsession of a widow is not just a family's horror. It is a city's legacy. Boston has buried its ghost beneath polished sermons, beneath ivy-clad universities, beneath hospitals where records vanish. But the silence is never complete. The cracks show, the names whisper, the tunnels still breathe. Thomas Hale, the minister's son, vanished into that house and was never seen again. His journal described a keeper of something not meant for God's light. And he was right, because some truths do not die with the dead. They linger. They pass through blood, through stone, through institutions that pretend to serve light while feeding darkness. The widow paid men to seed her daughters, but what she sought was not children. It was continuity, a lineage that carried not love, not faith, but a hunger older than Boston itself. And perhaps even now, when you walk Beacon Street at night, when the fog clings to the iron fences, when the lamps flicker, you may hear it, the faint sound of a cradle rocking, the echo of a woman's voice whispering from the walls. She kept the line. If you want more stories that were never meant to be remembered, subscribe, because silence protects the powerful, but here we break it.